May 19, 1536. The morning air was thick with a damp chill that clung to the stones of the Tower of London, the sky above smeared with a colorless gray, as though the heavens themselves refused to bear witness. Beneath this silent canopy, a scaffold unlike any other had been raised lower than the usual height, as if the very ground was drawing her downward into oblivion. And yet, this was no ordinary execution. This was not a traitor's death, not a criminal's. This was the end of a queen. The first English royal woman to be executed by the very laws her husband had rewritten. Her name was already scorched by scandal, whispered in the corridors of power and poison, her legacy twisted before her body had even gone cold. Anne Boleyn, the woman, who once turned the tide of a kingdom, who ignited a king's obsession so fierce he severed ties with the Pope, defied Rome, and declared himself head of the church, all for her would now be silenced by the same hand that once trembled in her presence. The courtyard began to fill. Nobles, commoners, guards. They came not only for the spectacle, but for something older, darker, an echo of blood rituals and ancient justice. Beneath their muttered prayers and uneasy breaths, history sharpened its blade. Inside the stone walls, in a narrow chamber draped in shadows, Anne opened her eyes for the final time. It was her 17th day as a prisoner, her last dawn. No screams, no desperate pleas, just silence. The kind of silence only those who truly understand death can know. She had already dressed for it, long before the world stirred. Her gown gray, lined with fur, modest but elegant. Beneath it, a crimson bodice, chosen with painful intention. Not just to hide the blood, but to speak without words. She would not leave this world in shame. She would walk into death as she had walked into power, composed, deliberate, defiant. Her ladies in waiting stood like specters beside her, their eyes red, their hands trembling as they helped her with the layers of cloth that would be remembered more than her final words. And touched her throat lightly and said with a soft, almost playful resolve, "I have a little neck." A smile ghosted her lips. The women gasped, not from humor but from awe. This was not surrender. This was power distilled into its final form, grace in the face of annihilation. Once, she had made kings bend. Once, she had refused to be a mistress, demanded a crown, and changed the destiny of a nation. But in England, love never stood a chance against the machinery of power. Henry VIII had once written songs for her. Now he wrote her death warrant. Even as she prepared for execution, across the river in Whitehall Palace, he was making arrangements to marry her replacement. Not a week later, not a month, but within hours. He waited for the sound of cannon fire from the tower, his signal that the past had been erased. That Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was no more. But before she became legend, before her fate was carved into the blooded pages of Tudor history, she was just a girl with a fire to bright for the cage she was born into. Born into the rising Boleyn family, and was not the beauty of her time. She was not fair-skinned, nor golden-haired like the ideal English rose. Her skin was olive, her hair dark as raven's wings, her eyes black and unyielding. And yet, wherever she walked, rooms paused, not because of charm but because of force. She had been sent to the courts of Europe, where she was shaped by the hands of queens, sculpted by French sophistication and sharpened by Renaissance intellect. She studied languages, music, politics, absorbing power not through inheritance, but through sheer will. When she returned to England in 1522, she carried with her something terrifying to the old order: independence. She watched her sister Mary become the king's mistress, used, praised, discarded, and, however, would not bow. She would not be touched and forgotten. When Henry VIII turned his gaze upon her, she turned it back and said no. Not with arrogance, but with clarity. "If you want me, truly want me," she told the most powerful man in England, "then make me your queen." It was a line drawn in blood and fire, a challenge not just to Henry, but to the throne itself. For 7 years, he pursued her. 7 years, he reshaped the world to win her. He defied the Pope, excommunicated himself from the Church, and tore apart 1,000 years of tradition. All to place a crown on her head. And wasn't merely a lover, she became the catalyst of the English Reformation. Through her, a nation was broken and remade. They married in secret in January of 1533. Anne was already pregnant, her womb carrying the promise of a dynasty. But when she gave birth, it was not the son Henry craved. It was a girl, Elizabeth. To Henry, it was a failure. To history, it was prophecy. The child he cast aside would become one of the greatest rulers the world has ever known. But Anne would not live to see it. Her time as queen was brief, just 3 years. 3 years of triumph and terror, of enemies closing in from all sides. The court was a nest of vipers, and Anne, for all her brilliance, was not invincible. She spoke too freely, argued too sharply, and made enemies faster than allies. She had won a crown, but not safety. Her failure to produce a male heir became a fatal weakness. Henry grew cold, and when Jane Seymour appeared, a woman soft-spoken, obedient, everything in was not the king's heart turned again. But he could not simply divorce Anne. He needed her destroyed. So false charges were forged: adultery, incest, treason. Her own brother was dragged down with her. The trials were a performance, the verdicts pre-written. Anne faced the accusations with fury and disbelief, but she understood the truth. This was not about guilt. This was about erasure. And now, in the gray morning, that erasure was nearly complete, but Anne Boleyn refused to vanish quietly. She stepped onto the scaffold not as a fallen queen but as a martyr of ambition. The crowd fell silent. Some crossed themselves. Others looked away. She gave a brief speech, dignified, loyal even to the unspeaking no of the king who betrayed her. But her eyes, her bearing, her silence, those said everything. The French executioner, brought in specially to make her death swift and clean, knelt in respect. She knelt too, her neck exposed to the steel. A drum beat once, then nothing, then the blade. In that moment, history did not end, it cracked open. The woman who had forced a king to defy an empire, who had dared to demand more than the world allowed, lay still, but she did not disappear. Not truly. Her blood soaked into the stones of the tower, but her legacy coursed into the veins of a daughter who would one day rise. Anne Boleyn had been born for fire, not silence. And though they tried to erase her, they forgot one truth: history remembers not the obedient, but the defiant. They buried her without ceremony in the cold chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, beneath the stones where traitors lay. No tomb, no monument, no inscription bore her name. Just a shallow grave among the nameless dead. The woman who had rewritten the fate of a kingdom was now a shadow buried beneath the feet of her enemies. And above her, the tower carried on its walls silent witnesses to the rise and ruin of Anne Boleyn. But history, as always, has a way of listening to the ghosts that refuse to stay buried. For even as her body decayed beneath the earth, her story began to rot the conscience of the world around her, and that rot would grow into revelation. The days after her execution were not quiet. They never are. Whispers bloomed like fungus in every corner of the court. The speed of her downfall, the spectacle of her death, the eerie calm with which she faced the blade, it all unsettled something deep and ancient in the hearts of those who watched. Some claimed the tower grew colder that summer, that her voice was heard in the corridors, that her shadow appeared at dusk, headless and searching. Of course, they were only stories. But in the Tudor world, stories had the weight of scripture. They lingered longer than laws. And Anne's story was already mutating, becoming legend, martyrdom, myth. And yet, in the eyes of power, she had been dealt with, erased. Henry VIII was free now. Unchained from his great whore, 11 days after her death, he married Jane Seymour, the woman who had stood in Anne's shadow while quietly preparing to take her place. Jane would give him the son he never could, but she would pay with her life as well, dying in childbirth. A grim reminder that the Tudor crown was bought and paid for in the blood of women. And so the cycle continued. Wives came and went, heads rolled, heirs were born and buried. But something in Henry changed after Anne. He grew heavier, darker, more paranoid. It's as if the woman he executed had left behind a curse not on his soul but on his memory. He spoke of her rarely. When he did, it was with a strange bitterness, as if he still needed to convince himself that her death had been justified. But deep inside, perhaps he knew what the world had begun to suspect. Anne Boleyn had not died because she was guilty. She died because she was dangerous. What is it about a woman with power that threatens the world so deeply? Anne was not the first to rise, nor the first to fall, but she was the first to make the court see that a woman could change the shape of nations not through seduction, but through strategy, and for that, she had to be closer destroyed. At the charges brought against her: adultery with multiple men, incest with her own brother, conspiring to kill the king. All delivered without real evidence, all designed to shame and shock, to turn the court against her before a word of truth could be spoken. They made her monstrous so that no one would ask why a queen had to die. They made her grotesque so that her brilliance could be forgotten, but some remembered. Over time, the tide began to turn. Foreign ambassadors, who once mocked her, began to write of her intelligence, her sharp mind, her political insight. Scholars re-examined the trials and uncovered the cracks. Historians found inconsistencies, false testimonies, fabricated confessions extracted under threat. One by one, the myths began to dissolve, and, they realized, had not fallen from grace. She had been pushed, sacrificed at the altar of dynastic ambition. A scapegoat wearing a crown, and while she vanished from the present, her future was already taking root. The daughter she left behind Elizabeth grew up under suspicion, branded as illegitimate, the daughter of a disgraced queen. She was watched, doubted, nearly erased herself, but blood remembers. And the fire that once burned in and flickered behind Elizabeth's eyes. When she finally rose to the throne in 1558, after decades of chaos, religious war, and betrayal, it was not just a coronation, it was a resurrection. The daughter of the executed queen would now rule alone, without a husband, without apology, for 45 years. The longest reign England had ever known, until then. The Elizabethan age named for the child Henry had never wanted would become a golden era of art, exploration, and power. And Anne Boleyn, once scorned, was reborn in her daughter's triumph. There is something haunting in this irony, that the woman who died for failing to give England a son gave it something far greater, a sovereign who would carry her legacy into eternity. It is almost as if Anne's life was not the prelude to tragedy, but to transformation, as if the blood spilled that morning in May soaked not only the stones of the tower, but the very roots of history itself. And like all seeds planted in sorrow, it grew into something unstoppable. But her redemption did not come easily. For centuries, and remained a divisive figure. Some still saw her as a temptress, a manipulator, the woman who broke a king and a church. Others saw her as a victim, a martyr, a feminist icon before the word even existed. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. And Boleyn was not perfect. She was proud, political, unrelenting. She made enemies and did not flinch when they sharpened their blades. But she was also brilliant, visionary, and fiercely committed to her daughter, her beliefs, and her sense of purpose. In a time when women were expected to be silent, she spoke, and for that, she was silenced. Even in death, her body was not allowed peace. In the 19th century, during renovations of the chapel where she lay, workers discovered a collection of bones buried hastily, without care. Among them, the remains of a woman matching Anne's age and description. They reinterred her beneath the floor, giving her a nameplate at last. A small gesture, too late, but still something. As if the world was trying to make amends, centuries too late, for a crime it could no longer deny. Today, when we speak of Anne Boleyn, we are not just telling a story about a queen. We are unearthing the bones of truth buried under layers of myth and politics. We are acknowledging that history is written by those who survive but haunted by those who don't. We are remembering that power always fears what it cannot control. And that sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the world is not a sword, but a woman who dares to say no. Anne's life was not a tragedy, it was a reckoning. She rose, she fought, she lost, but in losing, she became immortal. Her name, once meant to be forgotten, now echoes louder than ever, not because she was perfect, but because she was real. And in the darkest moments of her story, she gave us something rare and eternal, the defiant, unbreakable truth that even in death, dignity endures. Time, they say, heals all wounds, but history remembers the ones that were never allowed to close. And so Anne Boleyn lingers, not only in books and portraits, but in the invisible architecture of power itself. Her name, once forbidden in courtly circles, now hangs in the air like a question too dangerous to answer. Who decides which voices survive? Who gets to define guilt and innocence when the law serves the throne, not the truth? These are not merely questions of the past, they are warnings carved into the bones of the present. Because Anne's story is not unique, it is a pattern. A pattern of women who rise too far, speak too clearly, threaten too much, and are undone not by failure, but by fear. To understand Anne Boleyn's legacy is to step into a room where the air never warms. A place where ambition becomes accusation, where wit becomes wickedness, where influence becomes betrayal. The Tudor court was a theater of masks and daggers, one where the queen could be crowned on Sunday and condemned by Friday. And yet, In this storm of blood and roses, Anne's voice remains defiant, unfinished, echoing. There were whispers long after her death of secret letters, of confessions hidden away, of allies who tried to save her too late. Some said Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, engineered her downfall to protect his own ambitions, that he feared her intellect, her reformist views, her unwillingness to be controlled. Others said Henry simply tired of her inability to give him a son, her sharp tongue, her refusal to be docile. That her greatest sin was not infidelity, but independence. And still others point to Jane Seymour, the silent, calculating presence who waited just long enough in the wings before stepping into Anne's place. The truth, as always, was likely a venomous mix of all three. In a court where survival meant submission and chose confrontation, and for that, she was devoured. But the strange thing about Anne Boleyn's story is that it refuses to end. Centuries later, playwrights, poets, and filmmakers resurrect her in every form: villain, victim, visionary. She appears in marble statues, in whispered prayers from those who feel unseen, in feminist manifestos written long after the Tudor age had crumbled into dust. Some see her as a cautionary tale: beware the woman who wants too much. Others see her as a heroine, proof that one voice, even when silenced, can reshape a nation. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: Anne Boleyn's greatest legacy is not her death, it's her return. Because she did return not in body, but in blood. In her daughter Elizabeth, whose reign would overshadow even her father's. Elizabeth, who never married, who ruled alone, who wielded power with the precision of a blade and the grace of a ghost. And in every decision she made, every time she signed her name beneath the crown, Anne's shadow stretched just behind her. Silent, watching, vindicated. Some historians argue that Elizabeth rarely spoke of her mother, that she kept the memory locked away, buried beneath layers of royal protocol and political necessity. But look closer, the signs are there, not in words, but in actions, in the choice to remain unmarried, rejecting the fate that had destroyed Anne, in the fierce devotion to England above all else, a motherland perhaps shaped by the loss of her mother. In the quiet reburial of Anne's memory, not with monuments, but with power, Elizabeth didn't need to speak her mother's name, she lived it. And still, centuries later, the question remains: was Anne Boleyn truly guilty of the crimes for which she died? Adultery, incest, treason, each more grotesque than the last, but the deeper you dig, the more the story unravels. Witnesses recanted, evidence vanished, confessions were extracted through torture or fear. The very structure of the trial was designed not to find the truth, but to silence her before the truth could speak. She was convicted in a court where the outcome had already been sealed, her body sacrificed to preserve the dignity of a man whose own dignity had long since rotted away. And yet, in death, she became what she could never be in life: immortal, not just in memory, but in meaning. Her story became a lens through which we examine every woman who ever rose too far, every leader who was punished not for what she did, but for what she represented. The fear of female power is older than kingdoms, older than scripture, older than even the names we give to our gods. It is a fear born of control, and in Boleyn shattered control with nothing more than a refusal to bend. Today, in the Tower of London, tourists walk the same stones she once walked. They look up at the scaffold site where she once knelt. Some cry, some pray. Some simply stare in silence, sensing the weight of something unseen. And beneath their feet, beneath centuries of footsteps and flowers and whispered apologies, her grave still rests. A slab of stone, a name carved late, a legacy carved deeper. But what does it mean to survive history? Not just to be remembered, but to be understood. And Boleyn was never given that chance in life. Her voice was drowned in scandal, her truth buried beneath lies, her name spat like a curse. But the years have a way of peeling back the layers. And now, slowly, the truth has begun to breathe. She was brilliant, she was flawed, she was powerful, she was punished, and she was never truly erased. Anne's life is a reminder that history is not just the record of kings and wars and laws. It is also the long, slow scream of those who were silenced. It is the breath of the forgotten, the heartbeat of the accused, the echo of a woman who refused to disappear. And perhaps that is why she still haunts us. Because Anne Boleyn did what few ever do: she forced the world to see her, and even in death, it never looked away. So when you hear her name, let it not be with pity, but with reverence. Let it summon not her fall, but her fire. Let it speak not of the gallows, but of the crown she wore with defiance, the mind that outshone a king, the legacy that outlived them all. She was never meant to survive history. But she did, and in doing so, Anne Boleyn became something far more powerful than a queen. She became a reckoning.